So we're back. It's week 6 already. It seems like we just started doing this soon-to-be award-winning show just a few days ago, but we're already into week 6. Penn State's coming off of a 20-14 victory over Army in one of those, another sort of token Penn State slog it out, not too pretty, but they get the job done in the end kind of games. You know, maybe we kind of saw this coming by the fact that Army is a team that runs a triple option, so they take up a lot of time. Penn State's an offense that doesn't move very quickly, so that takes up a lot of time. You don't have Saquon Barkley, you don't have Akeel Lynch. The defense is missing a couple players, so it kind of set up to be more rain. So it kind of sets up for this kind of ugly-ish game. But at the end of the day, Penn State made enough plays to win. In a lot of respects, the game was not as close as the final score. But Army made enough plays in the final few minutes to sort of make things tight. They, you know, to their credit, Army gets the ball with a chance to essentially win the game. But Penn State's defense comes up big. Anthony Zettel gets a stop on third and short-ish, and then Jason Kabinda gets a sack on fourth down to basically seal the deal. Penn State kneels it out from there. So with the non-conference schedule out of the way, Penn State now turns its focus to Indiana. A big weekend for the program in a lot of different respects. But before we get to that, really just sort of your thoughts on the game this past weekend and what you saw moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think, you know, as was the big story this week, Penn State didn't come all that close to beating Army by as many points as they were predicted to. But as you put it, it wasn't as close of a game as it might have seemed to be by the 20-14 total. I mean, Penn State played well. They're probably not progressing as quickly as a lot of people would have liked to have seen by now. I think, especially in the offensive side of the ball, a lot of people wanted to see some more progress from where Penn State was 5 weeks ago against Temple, and they haven't seen that. And I think a lot of fans are hoping to see the offense sort of light up this week against Indiana. With the first really tough opponent coming up the week after that. But Indiana obviously is a pretty formidable opponent themselves. So the fact that Penn State is now done with its non-conference schedule and heading into the Big Ten slate, and the offense still doesn't seem to have put together a full four-quarter game yet is, I think, sort of something to be concerned about.
Yeah, and I think that some of that comes down to the weather that they've had, and some of it comes down to the players that they haven't had. I think if Penn State has Barkley and has Lynch against Army, maybe you have a different looking outcome, because I think Penn State's offense is committed to the run, and that's never going to be as flashy. I think people want to see Christian Hackenberg go deep down the field. They want to see Chris Godwin, who had some big catches in that game, be more involved in the offense. They want to see sort of the offense that Penn State had in the bowl game against Boston College. You figure if Penn State can bring that performance to this season on a regular basis or a semi-regular basis, that you have to feel pretty good about how they're doing on the field. But that really hasn't been the case.
Even with the options that you have at receiver, there's nothing wrong with being a run-heavy team. And I think the weather sort of dictated that was going to be the way that the game went on Saturday. The issue is that the number 1 and 2 running backs on the team were out. So I think if you have Saquon Barkley and Akeel Lynch healthy last week, you see a much different Penn State offense than what the product on the field was. And I guess it remains to be seen when we get both of those guys back on the field. Yeah. But when they are, I think Penn State sort of hit a stride for a couple weeks leading up to Army, where that run game was starting to pick up, and I think John Donovan and some of the coaches were starting to realize that, hey, maybe this doesn't have to be a team that's anchored by Christian Hackenberg in the passing game, and it can be a run-first approach that works for Penn State.
Yeah, I mean, and you have that balance, which has opened up the pass a little bit, and even if Penn State's a run-first offense right now, having that balance is going to keep defenses honest. It's going to give you those opportunities to go down the field, even just the opportunities to have those middle of the field pass plays that work out for you. And I think Nick Scott looked pretty good in a relief position at running back. He had 12 carries for 54 yards and a touchdown. Had a couple good runs in his own right, and he was the guy before the season started that I had him in the Barkley role as a guy that would have looked good. And obviously, I don't think anyone expected Barkley to look quite as flashy as he has.
At least not this quickly.
Yeah, at least not this quickly. So I think all of that, Penn State's fortunate in that regard because I think they have a much harder time winning that game against Army if they have to rely on the run and they don't have guys that can really do it. But either way, it's all going to have to come together this upcoming weekend against Indiana. So this weekend is probably one of, it's hard to rank most important games on your schedule because that's always changing week to week. But I think in a lot of respects, probably the most important game that Penn State's had since the season opened. If you figure that the Rutgers game is out of the way, and that's a big moment because Penn State can hit the reset button on the season, kind of get that sort of a big win under their belt, a win in primetime environment in front of a large crowd on national TV. And then these are the kinds of games where you can prove that you're making steps as a program, as an offense, as a defense forward to sort of getting back to where people are used to seeing Penn State. I think it's going to be difficult. I think Indiana is a better team than most people give them credit for because you sort of think of Indiana in a historical sense, which outside of a few outliers has really been a team that Penn State's dominated for most of this entire series. So I think it's going to be interesting because for two reasons, really. Indiana has been in close games the entire year, and they take Ohio State to the wire, losing. It's a 34-27 game, but Indiana has that final snap outside the end zone. It's a bad snap. They basically just have to chuck it into the end zone. It doesn't work out. But if Indiana, you get that touchdown, you get that 2-point conversion, or you just get the extra point, you're in a situation where you're facing a team. Penn State's facing a team that just knocked off the #1 team in the country. So in that light, it's hard to ever overlook a game like that. And I think especially when you're a program like Penn State that's just looking for every win that it can get, looking to establish that it's better than the programs that it's always been better than. I think all of those things combined with the fact that it's a Big Ten game and conference games always matter, that makes it a big game this weekend.
And I'm almost reluctant to get away from the X and O's and talk about some of the emotional stuff, but for Indiana coming off of a game where they're playing the #1 team in the country, they're leaving it all on the field, and it comes down to really the last 10 seconds of the game. That for the Hoosiers, they have to make sure that they sort of hit the reset button and refill their tank heading into this weekend, because that's a game that sort of takes a lot out of a team emotionally, I think.
Yeah, and I think you see that a lot of times, even on the flip side when you get a big win. I think you come off, you have to deal with all of the emotions. So either way, Indiana's going to be in a situation where they have to sort of put last week behind them. I think it helps a little bit because assuming that Nate Sudfeld plays this weekend, which I would guess that he is probably going to at least try and give it a go, you're going to have a quarterback that's been around for a while. You're going to have a guy running your offense this is not his first rodeo. So that can help a lot in sort of settling a team down and focusing on the moment. But very much so, I think emotions play a lot into how you look at Indiana as a team coming into this game. For a lot of this year, I think the big question for Indiana is where were they going to get their offense? Where were they going to make up for the loss of Tevin Coleman, who's off in the NFL right now? And Jordan Howard has been, I think, very good for them, over 5 yards a carry, over 700 yards on the year. Has really given them a balance for an offense that's been able to score a lot of points, granted, not against a lot of great opponents. But the fact that you're scoring points and moving the ball is really, just from watching Penn State, you go, that's not something that you can always take for granted. So I think this game very much is interesting from the standpoint of, can Penn State slow down an offense that's moved the ball? Can Penn State move the ball in its own right? And that comes down to things like we were talking about, like, do they get Barkley back?
Right. And I mean, Jordan Howard is a pretty formidable running back. You're not going to replace the guy who was your best offensive player for a few years running in Tevin Coleman, but he's done about as good of a job as you can in replacing him. And like you said, they're putting together some solid offensive games. And on the other side of the ball, you have a Penn State defense that's been playing opponents pretty hard, especially on the D line up front. So Nate Sudfeld's a guy that they've seen before, a guy that they're familiar with, but he's also a guy who has a lot of experience, as you pointed out. So it'll be a pretty interesting matchup between the Penn State defense and the Indiana offense.
Yeah, and a lot of that will come down to, can Penn State get Marcus Allen back on the field? Can it get Brandon Bell back on the field? I think when Penn State's defense has all of its parts together, that there's no reason that defense can't slow down Indiana's offense. But on the other hand, the more Penn State's offense struggles, the longer Penn State's defense has to stay on the field. I think you've seen that actually in the NFL with the Eagles this year. The Eagles last week, they had their defense on the field for 41 minutes, and that defense is very good, and the offense has struggled. And at the end of the game, Washington drives down the field against a gassed defense and wins that game in the final minutes. So for as good as Penn State's defense is, it really needs the offense to step up in a weekend like this to hang on to the ball, to keep them off the field, to just sort of give your entire time of possession, which sometimes can be an overrated statistic if you're scoring a lot of points. But Penn State's not really looking like a team that's just scoring points in bunches. So the longer that they're out on the field, the better overall Penn State probably is in this game.
Yeah, the concern for Penn State this year isn't scoring too quickly and throwing your defense back on the field.
Yeah, that's the least of their worries. But it should be an interesting game. I'm looking forward to it. I think we'll learn a lot about where Penn State is as a program. It's a game it's a really good test for both programs, really for different reasons. But I think if Penn State can win this game, probably more importantly for the big picture, it prevents them from getting into the potential for a bit of a tailspin because you're going to have to go to Ohio State, and you figure that Penn State's going to lose that game. Then you have to face Maryland, and Maryland, if they end up firing Randy Edsall before that game ever happens, Penn State's in a position to win that, but you've got Northwestern. I mean, the Big Ten schedule is a sort of thing where you can't take any of those games for granted. You saw that last year when they only win 2 in conference. Well, all of that, I mean, every win you can get, you have to get.
And especially this year, I know people like to look at the schedule and take note of the opponents like Ohio State and Michigan State, but with where Penn State is right now, games like Indiana and Rutgers are the big games in the schedule for Penn State. They're the teams that Penn State's most comparable to in terms of how good they are. I mean, sure, Penn State playing Ohio State and Michigan State is always fun, and if they win those games, all the better. But you have to beat the teams that are on your level first before you can start worrying about going into Columbus and taking out the.
You got to beat the teams you have to beat, or you ought to beat, before you can worry about beating the teams that you don't normally.
You can't lose games
and still win.
So
before we go, got to answer the folks' questions. They've got questions. The first one, I wrote them down this time so I would not forget, is a two-parter. The percentage that we see Akil Lynch back on the field this year and the percentage chance that Christian Hackenberg is back next year. And those we could probably break down into both of those for a long time, actually. But I think probably the easiest way to answer it is just being blunt. Akil Lynch is going to play again this year. Unless he's hurt more than Penn State is leading on, it might be a few more weeks before he's back. It's really hard to know, simply because the only thing we know about Akil Lynch's injury is the fact that he was injured. He wasn't at practice on Wednesday, at least not when the media was there. Saquon Barkley he was practicing. But I think Akil Lynch is back, so I'll say some arbitrarily positive percentage, like 85% chance that Akil Lynch is back.
I'll throw 90.
He's more confident than I am. In terms of the percentage chance that Christian Hackenberg is back next year, I would put it at like 15% because there's always a chance that something happens. He could get hurt and decide to come back. He could get hurt and decide to leave. So it's really just a matter of where does his stock stand in the eyes of people that know about it in a way that goes beyond how did he look last week against Army. But I don't think there's any real reason for Christian Hackenberg to come back because he's going to graduate this year. He's going to be done with his academics. Penn State's going to be in an okay place, and he's not really in an offense where you go, yeah, this guy looks really good. So I think at the end of the day, Hack has got to go because his stock is probably not going to go any higher than it is right now. But 15% because nothing is impossible.
Yeah, I'm throwing a 1 in there, a 1% chance. I think there's a 1 in 100 chance that one of those scenarios that you just so eloquently described happens to pan out and he doesn't come back next year. So I'm giving it a 1% chance that we don't see Christian Hackenberg in a Penn State uniform next year, and a 99% chance that he is on an NFL team.
That's no CFL. Well, that's the 1%. Well, the 1% that he comes back. So 98% chance.
The starting quarterback for the Montreal Alouettes.
Similarly, what's up with Adam Brenneman, and do you think the offense is holding back for Big Ten play? The first part, while no one has, it's difficult to answer the Brenneman question, but I think it's safe to say that when you get hurt and you get healthy, that maybe you don't get healthy all the way that you would like to be. Maybe you're not mentally in the place that you want to be. Maybe physically you're not. And sometimes when you've gotten hurt a lot in the same parts of your body, it just takes a while to recover, and you have side effects of that recovery process. So while I can't tell you specifically what exactly is up with Adam Brenneman, I think it's safe to say that he's not so much re-injured as much as he is just not healthy right now in football shape.
Yes, there's a difference between being healthy and being football ready, especially when it's an injury where you pretty much can't walk for a long period of time. So even once you're fully healed and you're ready to walk down the street, that doesn't necessarily mean that in terms of your physical well-being that you're up to football speed yet, and that takes some
and even a matter of just structurally being in a place where you might look healthy, but that doesn't mean that you are in a place where you are as healthy as you appear. But that's all sort of ambiguous, and
it's purely conjecture.
It is a bit. Does the offense holding back? I don't think that's the case. I think if Penn State has the opportunity to drop 40 points on teams each week, it's going to do that, and there's no reason to think that Penn State's a team that can do that this year. Are they holding back maybe a few things here or there? That's entirely possible. That's what makes things like the pass that they had, I can't remember who threw it now that I need to know, but the trick play that Penn State ran a couple weeks ago is one of those things where you go, well, why did you show that? And I think that really comes down to the fact that Penn State's not in a position where it can really hold anything back. It's not a team that can go like, well, we don't need to worry about this third of the playbook because we're going to save that for Ohio State. Penn State's trying to win every game it can as convincingly as it can, and right now they're only squeaking by. So I don't think they're holding back at all.
And I should point out that the question in full was whether or not Penn State is pulling a Rocky and holding back the left for the conference opponents. I don't really think it's a fair comparison because Rocky was a better boxer than Penn State is a football team this year.
Very true. And the last thing before we go is how is the team shaping up for next year, which is very sort of broad and difficult to answer question. But I think that next year will be interesting. I think that if Penn State is truly making strides towards being a better program and bringing in more talent, and that talent being prepared and ready to play, then you see steps moving forward that start next year. That's when things really, James Franklin is quickly running out of time to do nothing. And that doesn't mean that next year Penn State has to be in the running for the Big Ten title, but it means that Penn State has to look better. It has to look more coherent on offense. It has to stay the same on defense. And a lot of that is going to come down to who the quarterback is. And that right now, certainly it doesn't seem like Christian Hackenberg is going to be the quarterback of the future for Penn State for a lot of different reasons. But the question now will be, can they develop whoever this next quarterback is? Can they bring this guy in? Can they bring a Tommy Stevens in? Can they bring Zembeck in? Can they bring anybody who's already Trace McSorley and say, we need you to run the offense and we're going to grow you from where you are today to where really you can say whatever you want about how Hackenberg looks on the field, but he has a lot of tools and a lot of mental capabilities that a quarterback would work his entire college career to get to that point. So you have to be able to take a guy who is probably not as good as Christian Hackenberg mentally and physically and turn him into a guy that's going to run your offense. So how does Penn State look? I have to think they look better, but it's difficult to say for sure what better exactly translates to on the field.
And then there are pressing questions like, does Shane McGregor still have college eligibility?
You never know. I like the hair.
I mean, my genius point was going to be, it depends on who Penn State's quarterback is, and you sort of beat me to it. But that's the short and long of it. Penn State next year they have young guys who are getting better on offense. They have a solid running back core. They have a solid receiver group. The offensive line, by all accounts, is improving. Maybe not as quickly as people would like to see, but it is improving. So it's a lot of it's a matter of who's the guy taking snaps next year, and we don't know the answer to that yet. So.
Yeah, and it's entirely possible that if Barkley and these guys turn out to be as good as they at least appear to be, that Penn State doesn't need the quarterback to be the next coming of the peak Christian Hackenberg. It really just needs a guy that can manage the offense, that can make the throws that he has to make, and give the ball to Barkley and let him dance around and not fall over. So
a real Chad Pennington.
Yeah, I mean, people give game managers a really hard time. But game managers win a lot of games, so it doesn't have to be flashy.
Trent Dilfer won a Super Bowl.
Yeah, and you can't lose games in the NFL
and win
and still win.
Yeah.
So nevertheless, that's all very much down the road. Right now, we're just focused on Penn State and Indiana this week. Now on ESPN, no longer on ESPN2 at noon. Weather should be good. Game should be interesting. And until next time, I'm Ben Jones. That's Zach Berger. And we will see you guys next week as Penn State prepares for a trip to Columbus to take on the ought to still be ranked #1 Ohio State Buckeyes.